30-year-old struggling social worker Rachel Morrison was facing eviction from her cramped studio apartment while drowning in $189,000 of crushing student loan debt and working 3 part-time jobs just to afford ramen noodles when desperate. Family members and financial advisors unanimously begged her to avoid the completely worthless, fire-damaged Methodist church in rural New Mexico that came with $67,000 in overdue property taxes, no electricity or water, severe structural damage from a 2019 electrical fire, and a location 40 miles from the nearest grocery store. But she had no idea that investigating the strange, hollow sound beneath the charred altar floorboards would reveal a temperature-controlled hidden compartment containing 1,247 classified FBI surveillance files from domestic surveillance operations between 1963 and 1995, including records on civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and political dissidents that had been missing from federal archives for decades, transforming a desperate graduate facing homelessness into the recipient of a $12.8 million federal whistleblower reward and exclusive consulting contracts with congressional oversight committees investigating decades of illegal domestic surveillance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 30 years old, Rachel Morrison was staring at her 4th eviction notice in 6 months, surrounded by student loan collection demands totaling $189,000 from her master's degree in social work that had promised meaningful career opportunities, but delivered only part-time positions paying $18 per hour without benefits or job security. The educational debt catastrophe that had destroyed Rachel's young adult life included undergraduate loans of $67,000 for her psychology degree from Arizona State University, graduate school debt of $89,000 for her MSW from the University of New Mexico, and accumulated interest and fees that had grown her total obligations to $189,000 despite her attempts to minimize borrowing through work-study programs, graduate assistantships, and summer employment that paid barely enough to cover basic living expenses. The crushing financial reality that kept Rachel awake every night in her 400-square-foot studio apartment in Albuquerque's struggling international district was that her combined monthly income of $2,890 from 3 different social work positions could no longer cover even her most basic survival expenses. While minimum student loan payments consumed $1,650 monthly, leaving her with only $1,240 for rent, food, transportation, health insurance, and every other necessity of life in an increasingly expensive housing market. The career preparation that Rachel had pursued through 6 years of higher education, including internships at non-profit organizations, volunteer work with domestic violence survivors, and specialized training in trauma-informed care, had led to employment opportunities that paid wages insufficient for someone with a master's degree to achieve basic financial stability. The morning of October 15, 2024, had begun like every other overwhelming day in Rachel's increasingly desperate existence, with the 5 a.m. alarm that allowed her to complete student loan forbearance applications, income-driven repayment recalculations, and collection agency negotiations before leaving for her first job at 7:30 a.m. The daily schedule that controlled Rachel's every waking moment included 8 hours at Desert Hope Community Center, providing case management services for homeless individuals at 18 per hour, 4 hours of evening work at a crisis hotline paying $16 per hour, and weekend shifts at a group home for developmentally disabled adults that provided $19 per hour, but required overnight availability that left Rachel chronically exhausted and unable to pursue better-paying opportunities. The student loan crisis, that had begun during Rachel's undergraduate years at Arizona State. University included federal loans that seemed manageable when borrowed, but accumulated interest during graduate school deferment periods, private loans with variable interest rates that had increased from 4.2% to 11.8% since graduation, and loan servicer transfers that resulted in missed communications, incorrect payment applications, and default warnings that arrived without adequate notice or explanation. The loan servicing complications that Rachel navigated included Navient, Great Lakes, and Fed loan transfers that created administrative confusion, payment processing errors that didn't reduce principal balances despite months of on-time payments, and customer service representatives who provided conflicting information about income-driven repayment options and forgiveness programs. The graduate school financing decisions that had seemed necessary for Rachel's career goals included additional borrowing for living expenses during unpaid internships required for MSW completion, conference attendance and professional development costs that added $4,200 to her debt burden, and thesis research expenses that weren't covered by graduate assistantships but were essential for program completion. The career preparation investments that Rachel had made included social work licensing fees of $890, continuing education requirements costing $1,400 annually, and professional liability insurance at $340 yearly that were necessary for employment, but consumed income she desperately needed for basic survival. The employment reality that Rachel discovered after graduation included social work positions that required master's degrees but paid wages comparable to jobs requiring only high school education, nonprofit organizations that offered meaningful work but couldn't afford competitive salaries due to funding limitations, and government positions that provided better compensation but required years-long waiting lists and extensive background investigations. The job search complications that Rachel experienced included positions advertised at competitive salaries that were reduced during hiring processes, full-time opportunities that were converted to part-time contracts without benefits, and employment offers that were rescinded due to funding cuts or organizational restructuring. The multiple employment necessity that Rachel had adopted included morning case management work at Desert Hope Community Center, serving chronically homeless individuals with severe mental illness and substance abuse disorders, evening crisis intervention at the New Mexico Crisis Line, providing suicide prevention and mental health support, and weekend residential care at Horizons Group Home, supervising adults with developmental disabilities during overnight shifts. The work schedule coordination that consumed Rachel's non-working hours included transportation between 3 different job locations across Albuquerque, documentation requirements for each position that required unpaid time for case notes and treatment planning, and continuing education obligations that were necessary for maintaining professional licensing but conflicted with work schedules. The income-driven repayment complications that Rachel navigated included annual recertification requirements that demanded extensive documentation of income and expenses, payment calculations that changed monthly based on variable part-time earnings, and forgiveness program requirements that seemed designed to prevent successful completion rather than provide genuine debt relief. The public service loan forgiveness pursuit that Rachel attempted included employment certification forms that were frequently rejected due to technical errors, payment counting discrepancies that eliminated months of progress toward forgiveness, and program requirement changes that occurred without adequate notice to borrowers who had been making payments based on previous program guidelines. The forbearance and deferment cycles that Rachel had experienced included temporary payment suspensions that provided immediate relief but accumulated capitalized interest that increased total debt balances. economic hardship deferments that required detailed financial documentation and annual renewal processes, and unemployment deferments during brief periods between contract positions that left gaps in payment history, affecting forgiveness program eligibility. The interest capitalization that occurred during forbearance periods had increased Rachel's principal balance from $156,000 at graduation to $189,000 after 18 months of sporadic payments and temporary suspensions. The credit score destruction that resulted from student loan payment difficulties had reduced Rachel's FICO score from 689 to 412. Eliminating her access to conventional credit cards, apartment rentals in safer neighborhoods, and employment opportunities that required credit checks for positions involving financial responsibilities. The credit damage had created cascading problems, including security deposit requirements of $1 to $200 for utilities and rental applications, higher insurance premiums that increased monthly expenses by $156 for auto coverage, and disqualification from federal employment opportunities that required financial background investigations. The housing crisis that Rachel faced in Albuquerque included studio apartment rent that consumed 62% of her gross income, utilities, and basic expenses that exceeded her remaining earnings after student loan payments, and frequent moves when landlords discovered her debt-to-income ratio exceeded acceptable lending standards. The rental application complications that Rachel encountered included application fees of $150 to $250 per property that consumed money she needed for food, security deposit requirements that exceeded her available savings, and income verification, standards that required gross monthly income of 3 times rental amounts, while her variable, part-time earnings made income documentation difficult. The transportation complications that threatened Rachel's ability to maintain multiple employment positions included a 2015 Nissan Sentra that needed $3,400 in repairs she couldn't afford, expired vehicle registration due to inability to pay renewal fees and pass emissions testing with necessary mechanical work, and auto insurance cancellation that occurred when automatic payments failed due to insufficient funds in her checking account. The vehicle reliability problems that affected Rachel's employment included frequent breakdowns that made her late for mandatory shifts, maintenance issues that required emergency repairs using payday loan advances at predatory interest rates, and transportation uncertainty that prevented Rachel from accepting additional work opportunities that required reliable arrival times. The health insurance complications that Rachel faced included employer-sponsored coverage that wasn't available. Through her part-time positions, marketplace insurance premiums that consumed 18% of her gross income, and high-deductible plans that provided minimal coverage for routine healthcare while requiring co-payments she couldn't afford. The healthcare access limitations that resulted from Rachel's insurance situation included postponement of routine preventive care, rationing of prescription medications to make them last longer, and avoidance of mental health treatment, despite working in trauma-exposed positions that required emotional support and stress management. The food insecurity that had developed during Rachel's financial crisis included reliance on food pantries, serving social service workers, elimination of grocery shopping except for basic necessities like bread and peanut butter, and frequent meal skipping when work schedules conflicted with food service availability. The nutritional challenges that accompanied Rachel's financial stress included irregular eating patterns due to long work hours and transportation between job sites, limited access to fresh foods due to time and financial constraints, and the physical exhaustion that made meal preparation difficult after working 60-hour weeks across multiple emotionally demanding positions. The professional development limitations that Rachel experienced included inability to attend conferences, that could provide networking opportunities and career advancement, elimination of continuing education beyond minimum licensing requirements, and reduced participation in professional organizations due to membership fees that competed with basic survival expenses. The career advancement barriers that resulted from Rachel's financial situation included geographic limitations that prevented pursuing better opportunities in other cities, inability to take unpaid internships or volunteer positions that could lead to permanent employment, and time constraints that eliminated evening classes or additional certifications that could qualify her for higher-paying positions. The student loan default consequences that Rachel faced included wage garnishment, threats that would reduce her take-home pay by 15%, tax refund seizure that eliminated her annual $890 refund needed for vehicle registration and basic maintenance, and collection agency harassment that included daily phone calls and threatening letters demanding immediate payment of amounts exceeding her annual income. The default rehabilitation requirements that loan servicers offered included payment amounts that exceeded Rachel's available income after basic survival expenses, rehabilitation programs that required 9 consecutive on-time payments but didn't account for variable part-time earnings, and consolidation options that extended repayment periods while increasing total interest costs. The family relationship strain that had developed during Rachel's crisis included disappointed parents who had co-signed private loans and now faced their own credit damage from Rachel's payment difficulties, siblings who questioned Rachel's career choices and suggested abandoning social work for more lucrative fields, and extended family members who offered advice about just paying off the loans without understanding the mathematical impossibility of Rachel's situation. The generational misunderstanding that characterized family discussions included older relatives who had attended college when tuition costs were manageable, assumptions that social work would provide middle-class income and stability, and frustration with Rachel's resistance to career changes that would abandon her professional training and personal values. The social isolation that characterized Rachel's current situation included elimination of social activities that required spending money, reduced participation in professional networking events due to registration fees and transportation costs, and emotional exhaustion that made maintaining friendships difficult during the constant stress of juggling multiple jobs while managing overwhelming debt obligations. The relationship impact that accompanied Rachel's financial crisis included dating limitations, when every conversation involved financial stress, inability to participate in social activities with colleagues who could afford entertainment, and travel and isolation from graduate school friends who had found better-paying positions or had family financial support that Rachel lacked. The mental health impact that Rachel experienced included anxiety attacks triggered by collection agency calls, depression symptoms that affected her job performance in emotionally demanding social work positions, and chronic stress that caused physical symptoms, including insomnia, digestive problems, and frequent headaches that required medical attention she couldn't afford. The irony of Rachel's situation included providing mental health support and crisis intervention for clients while being unable to access mental health care for her own stress-related symptoms, understanding trauma-informed care principles while experiencing financial trauma that affected every aspect of her daily life. The professional ethics complications that arose from Rachel's financial stress included conflicts between her commitment to client advocacy and her need to maintain employment at organizations with policies she disagreed with, time management challenges when financial crisis consumed mental energy needed for effective clinical work, and performance concerns when chronic stress affected her ability to provide quality services to vulnerable populations who depended on her professional expertise. The utility service threats that escalated throughout October included electricity disconnection warnings from PNM due to $340 in unpaid bills accumulated when Rachel prioritized student loan payments over utilities. Internet service cancellation that would eliminate her ability to complete required documentation for all 3 employment positions, and cell phone service suspension warnings that threatened her communication capabilities essential for crisis intervention work. The utility restoration requirements that Rachel couldn't meet included security deposits of $200–400 per service, payment of outstanding balances plus reconnection fees, and same-day payment demands that required funds she needed for transportation. And food. The banking relationship deterioration that occurred when Rachel's checking account was overdrawn for 4 consecutive months included automatic closure by Bank of America due to excessive overdraft fees totaling $1,240 in accumulated penalties, elimination of direct deposit capabilities that forced reliance on expensive check cashing services, and forced use of prepaid debit cards that charged fees for basic transactions while providing no banking services that could help establish financial stability. The financial isolation that resulted from losing traditional banking access had forced Rachel to conduct transactions through money orders and cash advances that consumed additional money while providing no fraud protection or credit-building opportunities. The employment discrimination that Rachel encountered included age-based assumptions that she was inexperienced despite her graduate education, salary negotiations that resulted in reduced offers when employers learned about her debt obligations, and performance evaluations that reflected concerns about her financial stability, affecting her professional judgment in positions requiring decision-making about client welfare and resource allocation. The professional reputation concerns that emerged during Rachel's crisis included documentation of stress-related performance issues that could affect future employment opportunities, concerns from supervisors about her emotional stability during client interactions, and potential implications for professional licensing if her financial problems became known to state regulatory boards. The prescription medication access problems that developed when Rachel's insurance coverage required high deductibles included elimination of anxiety medications that cost $89 monthly after insurance, rationing of allergy medications during Albuquerque's severe pollen seasons, and avoidance of preventive medications that could prevent more expensive health problems. The medical care postponement that Rachel implemented included cancellation of routine gynecological appointments that required co-payments and time off work, elimination of dental cleanings that could prevent expensive problems, and avoidance of vision care despite working extensively with computer screens and documents that strained her eyesight. The seasonal employment complications that Rachel experienced included reduced hours at the group home during summer months when residents participated in day programs, elimination of crisis hotline overtime during holiday periods when call volume decreased, and competition for additional shifts when other part-time employees needed extra income during slow periods. The income volatility that resulted from multiple part-time positions included monthly earnings that ranged from $2,200 to $3,400, depending on client census and available shifts, making budgeting impossible and preventing consistent student loan payments that could improve her payment history. The professional development debt that Rachel had accumulated included conference registration fees charged to credit cards during graduate school, professional organization memberships that provided networking opportunities but consumed money needed for basic expenses, and continuing education courses that were required for licensing renewal but weren't covered by employers who benefited from Rachel's updated training. The career investment costs that continued accumulating included professional liability insurance, annual renewals, state licensing fees, and background check costs for employment applications that competed with food and transportation expenses. The neighborhood safety concerns that Rachel faced in her affordable housing included increasing crime rates in areas where she could afford rent, lack of reliable transportation affecting her ability to leave dangerous situations, and isolation from support networks due to frequent moves when landlords discovered her financial situation. The housing instability that characterized Rachel's living situation included temporary arrangements with roommates who moved frequently, sublet situations that provided no legal protections, and constant apartment searching that consumed time and money needed for work and debt management. The tax complications that Rachel experienced included inability to claim education credits due to her loan default status, loss of tax refunds to student loan collection that eliminated her primary source of emergency funds, and additional tax obligations when loan forgiveness amounts were treated as taxable income, despite providing no actual financial benefit. The financial planning impossibility that characterized Rachel's situation included inability to establish emergency savings when every dollar was needed for immediate survival, elimination of retirement planning despite working for employers that offered 403B plans, and avoidance of financial counseling services that charged fees she couldn't afford. The debt collection harassment that Rachel experienced included daily phone calls beginning at 8 a.m. and continuing until 9 p.m., threatening letters that warned of wage garnishment and asset seizure, and collection agency representatives who demanded payment arrangements that exceeded Rachel's available income after basic survival expenses. The collection agency tactics that Rachel encountered included threats to contact her employers about debt obligations, warnings that her professional licenses could be affected by unpaid student loans, and demands for financial disclosure that revealed her complete inability to satisfy debt obligations while maintaining employment in social service positions. The mathematical impossibility of Rachel's situation was that her minimum monthly obligations totaled $3,290, while her variable income averaged $2,890, creating a deficit of $400 monthly that grew larger as interest and penalties accumulated on unpaid balances. The conventional financial advice that Rachel received from credit counselors and financial advisors included bankruptcy recommendations that wouldn't eliminate student loan debt, debt consolidation options that required credit scores she no longer possessed, and income increase suggestions that ignored the reality of social work salary limitations and the time investment required to change career fields. The legal proceeding threats the collection agencies made included garnishment warnings that would reduce Rachel's take-home pay below survival levels, asset seizure possibilities that included her vehicle essential for maintaining employment, and credit reporting that would further damage her ability to secure housing and employment. The legal representation that Rachel couldn't afford included consultation fees of $200–300 per hour for attorneys experienced in student loan defense, court filing fees for bankruptcy proceedings that wouldn't address her primary debt obligations, and travel expenses for legal proceedings that conflicted with work schedules she couldn't afford to miss. At this moment of complete financial collapse, with student loan debt that exceeded her lifetime earning potential in social work while struggling to maintain employment that provided meaningful service but inadequate compensation, Rachel faced an impossible choice between abandoning her professional calling for higher-paying work that contradicted her values or continuing in social work while accepting homelessness and financial destruction that seemed inevitable given the mathematical reality of her obligations versus her income potential in her chosen field. But what Rachel couldn't have known, as she prepared for another day of collection agency harassment and financial terror on that October morning, was that a certified letter she would discover in her mailbox that afternoon would present an opportunity that seemed guaranteed to complete her financial destruction while actually providing the discovery that would transform her desperate circumstances into extraordinary wealth and historical significance that exceeded anything a struggling social worker from Albuquerque could have imagined during those dark months of debt and professional disappointment that had consumed her life since graduating with the education that was supposed to provide career stability and meaningful work. The educational catastrophe that would ultimately destroy Rachel Morrison's financial life and transform her from an idealistic college student into a debt-trapped social worker had begun on what seemed like a triumphant day in May 2016, when 18-year-old Rachel received her acceptance letter to Arizona State University's psychology program, along with a financial aid package that appeared to make her dream of helping vulnerable populations achievable through higher education. Rachel, the first person in her family to attend a 4-year university, had grown up in Las Cruces, New Mexico, watching her mother Maria struggle as a single parent working 2 jobs, housekeeping at a hotel during the day and stocking shelves at Walmart overnight, while raising 3 children on wages that never quite covered basic expenses despite 60-hour work weeks. The family financial background that shaped Rachel's educational decisions included her mother's annual income of $28,000 from 2 jobs that provided no benefits or advancement opportunities, child support payments that averaged $240 monthly, when Rachel's father remembered to send them, and household expenses that consumed every available dollar while leaving no money for college savings or educational planning. The generational poverty cycle that Rachel was determined to break included watching her older brother Miguel drop out of high school at 17 to work construction jobs that paid better than their mother's retail work, but offered no long-term security, and seeing her younger sister Carmen struggle academically due to lack of tutoring and educational support that their family couldn't afford. The college recruitment process that had convinced Rachel to pursue higher education included guidance counselors who emphasized that student loans were investments in her future that would be easily repaid with the increased earning potential that came with college degrees, university financial aid officers who presented borrowing as normal and necessary for achieving career goals, and family members who encouraged Rachel to do whatever it takes to get the education that would provide opportunities they had never had. The financial aid packaging that Rachel received for her freshman year included $5,500 in federal Pell Grant funding that didn't require repayment, $5,500 in subsidized federal loans, $2,000 in unsubsidized federal loans, and a $15,000 gap between actual costs and aid that required private loans or family contribution. The private loan necessity that became apparent during Rachel's freshman year orientation included living expenses that exceeded the university's cost of attendance estimates, textbook costs that averaged $1,200 per semester, despite used book purchases and rental programs, and transportation expenses for traveling between Las Cruces and Tempe that consumed additional hundreds of dollars monthly. The private loan application process that Rachel navigated with her mother's co-signature included Sallie Mae loans at 7.25% interest rates, Discover student loans at 6.99% variable rates that would increase over time, and Wells Fargo education, loans that required immediate interest payments while Rachel was enrolled full-time. The work-study program limitations that Rachel discovered during her first semester included campus jobs that paid minimum wage for maximum 15 hours weekly, scheduling conflicts between work requirements and class attendance that affected her academic performance, and competition for positions that provided slightly better pay or relevant experience for psychology majors. The off-campus employment that Rachel pursued to supplement work-study income included weekend restaurant server positions that paid $2.13 per hour, plus tips that averaged $12 to $18 per hour, depending on shifts, retail jobs at Target and Best Buy, that provided $9 per hour but required availability during class times, and tutoring work that paid $15 per hour but was inconsistent and required transportation to clients' homes. The academic performance pressure that Rachel experienced during her undergraduate years included maintaining the 3.0 GPA required for continued financial aid eligibility while working 25 hours weekly to cover living expenses, completing psychology coursework that demanded extensive reading and research time that competed with work obligations, and participating in unpaid internships that were required for degree completion but reduced available hours for income-generating employment. The grade point average struggles that Rachel faced included difficulty concentrating during lectures after working late restaurant shifts, reduced study time due to work schedule demands, and stress-related health problems that affected test performance and assignment completion. The summer employment challenges that Rachel encountered included return to Las Cruces, where job opportunities were limited to retail and food service, positions paying minimum wage, inability to maintain campus housing during summer months that required finding temporary accommodation, and pressure to work full-time during breaks to reduce borrowing for the following academic year, while also completing summer coursework to stay on track for graduation. The summer living arrangements that Rachel managed included staying with her mother in the overcrowded mobile home, where privacy for studying was impossible, temporary housing with relatives who charged rent she could barely afford, and brief periods of sleeping in her car when other arrangements fell through. The major selection pressure that influenced Rachel's academic trajectory included psychology professors who encouraged students to pursue graduate education for meaningful career opportunities, career counselors who emphasized that bachelor's degrees in psychology provided limited employment options without additional education, and internship supervisors at community mental health centers who explained that clinical social work positions required master's-level training. The graduate school preparation that consumed Rachel's junior and senior years included GRE test preparation courses that cost $890, application fees totaling $200 for 8 different MSW programs, and interview travel expenses exceeding $2,400 for campus visits and admission meetings. The undergraduate loan accumulation that occurred despite Rachel's attempts to minimize borrowing included annual increases in tuition and fees that averaged 6% yearly, living expense inflation that exceeded her work income growth, and textbook costs that continued rising despite digital alternatives and rental programs. The loan servicer communications that Rachel received during college included annual disclosures showing growing balances, interest rate notifications for variable loans that increased from 6.99% to 9.25% during her junior year, and exit counseling requirements that emphasized repayment obligations without adequately explaining income-driven options or forgiveness programs. The family financial strain that developed during Rachel's undergraduate years included her mother taking on additional cleaning jobs to help with college expenses, reduced household budget for Carmen's educational needs while supporting Rachel's college costs, and credit card debt that Maria accumulated for emergency expenses that arose while helping fund Rachel's education. The guilt and pressure that Rachel experienced included awareness that her family was sacrificing for her education, expectations that her degree would lead to financial success that could help her family, and anxiety about justifying the investment her mother was making in her future. The graduate school decision that Rachel made during her senior year included acceptance to the University of New Mexico's Master of Social Work program with partial funding through a graduate assistantship that provided $12,000 annually, plus tuition remission, but required additional borrowing of $35,000 yearly for living expenses and program costs not covered by the assistantship. The MSW program selection factors that influenced Rachel's choice included UNM's reputation for training social workers who served Hispanic and indigenous populations, proximity to her family in New Mexico, and specialization tracks in trauma-informed care and community mental health that aligned with Rachel's career goals. The graduate assistantship responsibilities that Rachel accepted included 20 hours weekly of research assistance for faculty studying domestic violence intervention programs, teaching undergraduate psychology discussion sections for students who were often only 2 or 3 years younger than Rachel, and administrative support for the social work department that required evening and weekend availability during program events and student recruitment activities. The assistantship compensation that provided tuition remission didn't cover mandatory fees, health insurance, parking permits, or technology requirements that added $3,400 annually to Rachel's educational expenses. The graduate school living arrangements that Rachel managed included shared apartments with other graduate students where rent consumed 60% of her assistantship income, utilities and basic expenses that exceeded her remaining funds, and transportation costs for field placement requirements that demanded reliable vehicle access for visiting clients in rural areas around Albuquerque. The vehicle necessity that became apparent during Rachel's first semester of graduate school included purchasing a used 2010 Honda Civic for $8,900 financed through a credit union loan at 12.5% interest, auto insurance costs that exceeded $180 monthly due to her age and limited credit history, and maintenance expenses that competed with food and rent for limited budget allocation. The field placement complications that arose during Rachel's graduate training included unpaid internships at community mental health centers that required 40 hours weekly of client contact, documentation, and training activities, transportation to placement sites that were often 30 to 50 miles from campus, and professional clothing requirements that consumed additional hundreds of dollars. For business attire appropriate for clinical settings, the internship supervision requirements that affected Rachel's schedule included weekly individual meetings with licensed clinical social workers, group supervision sessions that occurred during evening hours, and continuing education attendance that required travel to professional development workshops. The thesis research requirements that Rachel encountered during her final year of graduate school included data collection from domestic violence survivors that required sensitive interview skills and flexible scheduling, literature review and analysis that demanded access to expensive databases and research materials, and thesis defense preparation that required additional meetings with faculty advisors beyond regular coursework obligations. The thesis completion pressure that Rachel experienced included program requirements for graduation that couldn't be waived or postponed, research costs for transcription services and data analysis software that exceeded $1,200, and time management challenges when thesis work competed with assistantship duties and part-time employment needed for basic survival. The graduate school social isolation that Rachel experienced included limited time for relationships due to work and study obligations, financial inability to participate in social activities with classmates who had family financial support, and geographic distance from undergraduate friends who had entered the workforce immediately after graduation. The peer comparison stress that affected Rachel's graduate school experience included classmates who received family financial support for living expenses, students who could afford to focus exclusively on academics without employment obligations, and colleagues who participated in unpaid volunteer opportunities that provided networking advantages but weren't financially feasible for Rachel. The mental health impact that accumulated during Rachel's graduate training included anxiety about academic performance while managing work obligations, depression symptoms related to constant financial stress and social isolation, and emotional exhaustion from providing therapy and crisis intervention for clients while struggling with personal mental health challenges. The irony of clinical training that Rachel experienced included learning to assess and treat trauma while experiencing financial trauma that affected every aspect of her daily life, studying self-care and wellness principles while being unable to afford mental health treatment for her own stress-related symptoms. The professional development expenses that accumulated during graduate school included social work licensing application fees of $340, background check costs for field placement clearances totaling $180, and conference attendance that provided networking opportunities but required registration fees, travel costs, and time away from paid employment. The professional organization membership costs that were recommended for career development included National Association of Social Workers dues at $195 annually, state licensing board fees, and specialty certification programs that could improve employment prospects but required additional time and financial investment. The loan counseling sessions that Rachel attended during graduate school included federal loan exit counseling. That emphasized repayment obligations, private loan disclosures that explained variable interest rate risks, and financial literacy workshops that provided budgeting advice for people with regular income rather than addressing the reality of variable graduate assistant wages. The loan consolidation options that were presented to Rachel included federal loan consolidation that could simplify payments but might eliminate benefits, private loan refinancing that required excellent credit scores she didn't possess, and income-driven repayment plans that seemed manageable based on projected social work salaries. The graduation ceremony that marked the completion of Rachel's MSW program in May 2022 included celebration with family members who were proud of her achievement but concerned about her debt obligations, job search pressure that began immediately due to loan repayment requirements, and recognition that her total educational debt of $156,000 exceeded the annual starting salaries for social work positions she was qualified to pursue. The post-graduation reality that Rachel faced included 6-month grace periods on federal loans that provided temporary relief but accumulated interest, private loan repayment requirements that began immediately, and employment search in a social work job market that offered meaningful work at wages insufficient for loan repayment and basic living expenses. The licensing examination pressure that Rachel encountered after graduation included social work, licensing exam fees of $230, study material costs exceeding $400, and test preparation time that competed with job search activities and income-generating employment. The licensing supervision requirements that affected Rachel's early career included finding licensed clinical social workers willing to provide required supervision for minimal compensation, documentation requirements that demanded additional unpaid time beyond client contact hours, and continuing education obligations that required ongoing financial investment in professional development. The first employment reality that Rachel discovered included social work positions that required master's degrees but paid wages comparable to jobs requiring only bachelor's level education. Non-profit organizations that offered meaningful work but couldn't compete with private sector salaries, and government positions that provided better compensation but required extensive background investigations and waiting periods that could exceed 6 months. The salary negotiation limitations that Rachel encountered included standard wage scales that left little room for individual negotiation, benefit packages that didn't offset lower base salaries, and geographic limitations that prevented pursuing opportunities in higher-paying markets due to licensing requirements and family obligations. The loan repayment shock that began 6 months after graduation included minimum monthly payments totaling $1,650 for federal and private loans combined, interest rates that had increased during graduate school deferment periods, and payment calculations based on standard 10-year repayment schedules that assumed higher income levels than social work positions provided. The income-driven repayment application process that Rachel pursued included extensive documentation requirements, annual recertification obligations, and payment calculations that provided some relief but extended repayment periods while increasing total interest costs over the life of the loans. The employment benefits reality that Rachel discovered included social work positions that offered health insurance with high deductibles and limited mental health coverage, retirement plans that required employee contributions she couldn't afford while managing loan payments, and paid time-off policies that discouraged taking vacation or sick leave due to coverage requirements in clinical settings. The professional liability insurance necessity that Rachel encountered included annual premiums of $340 for coverage required by employers and licensing boards, continuing education requirements that cost $1,400 annually for license renewal, and professional development expectations that competed with basic survival expenses. The economic recession impact that affected Rachel's early career included social service funding cuts that reduced available positions and increased competition. Among qualified candidates, nonprofit organizations that eliminated benefits or reduced hours to manage budget constraints, and government hiring freezes that limited opportunities in better-paying public sector positions. The employment instability that characterized Rachel's early social work career included contract positions that provided no job security, part-time opportunities that required multiple employers for adequate income, and high turnover rates in social service organizations that created constant job searching and interview expenses. The family expectation pressure that Rachel experienced after graduation included assumptions that her master's degree would lead to middle-class income and stability, questions about when she would be able to help family members financially as her education had promised, and disappointment when Rachel's income wasn't sufficient for the lifestyle that family members associated with advanced education. The generational misunderstanding that characterized discussions about Rachel's career included older relatives who had achieved financial stability without college degrees, assumptions that higher education automatically led to higher income, and frustration with Rachel's inability to achieve rapid financial success despite educational investment. The relationship impact that Rachel's financial situation created included dating challenges when every activity required money she didn't have, social isolation from colleagues who could afford entertainment and travel, and family stress when Rachel couldn't contribute to household expenses or family emergencies. The peer comparison stress that continued after graduation included classmates who had secured better-paying positions through family connections, colleagues who received family financial support that allowed them to accept lower-paying but prestigious opportunities, and social media comparisons with undergraduate friends who had entered private sector careers with higher starting salaries. The professional disillusionment that Rachel experienced included recognition that social work education had prepared her for meaningful work but not financial stability, awareness that student loans had created debt obligations that exceeded the earning potential of her chosen profession, and conflict between personal values that drew her to social work and financial pressures that suggested career change might be necessary for survival. The career counseling that Rachel pursued included meetings with professors who acknowledged the financial challenges in social work but encouraged persistence, career advisors who suggested additional education or specialization that would require more borrowing, and financial planners who recommended career changes that would abandon her professional training and personal calling. The loan servicer complications that Rachel encountered during her early career included transfers between different companies that created communication gaps and payment processing errors, customer service representatives who provided conflicting information about repayment options and forgiveness programs, and automated systems that didn't account for variable income or special circumstances affecting payment ability. The loan modification attempts that Rachel pursued included hardship deferments that provided temporary relief but accumulated interest, income-driven recalculations that required extensive documentation and annual renewals, and consolidation, options that simplified payments but might eliminate benefits or forgiveness eligibility. The credit score impact that resulted from occasional missed payments during periods of unemployment or reduced income included damage that affected Rachel's ability to rent apartments, qualify for lower interest rates on necessary loans, and pass background checks for some social work positions that required financial responsibility assessments. The financial planning impossibility that Rachel faced included inability to establish emergency savings when loan payments consumed all available income above basic survival expenses, elimination of retirement planning despite employer matching, programs that could provide long-term security, and avoidance of financial goal setting when immediate survival required all available resources and mental energy. The debt counseling that Rachel pursued through non-profit credit counseling organizations included budgeting advice that didn't address the reality of income insufficient for both loan payments and basic living expenses, debt management plans that required monthly payments exceeding her available income, and bankruptcy consultations that revealed student loans weren't dischargeable, while bankruptcy would damage her credit and potentially affect professional licensing. The financial education that Rachel received through these consultations included recognition that her debt-to-income ratio exceeded manageable levels, understanding that standard financial advice didn't apply to her situation, and awareness that conventional debt resolution strategies were inadequate for addressing student loan obligations that exceeded reasonable borrowing levels. The mental health deterioration that Rachel experienced during her transition from graduate school to professional practice included anxiety attacks triggered by loan payment due dates, depression symptoms that affected her job performance in emotionally demanding social work positions, and stress-related physical symptoms including insomnia, digestive problems, and frequent headaches that required medical attention she couldn't afford. The professional therapy need that Rachel recognized but couldn't access included understanding that her financial trauma was affecting her ability to provide effective clinical services, awareness that her personal stress was creating countertransference, issues with clients facing similar financial struggles, and recognition that her own mental health was deteriorating while she provided mental health services to others. The geographic limitation impact that Rachel's student loans created included inability to relocate for better employment opportunities due to moving costs and licensing transfer requirements, restriction to New Mexico job market that offered limited social work positions with competitive salaries, and elimination of opportunities in higher cost of living areas where social work salaries might be higher but wouldn't offset increased housing and living expenses. The career flexibility reduction that resulted from loan obligations included pressure to maintain steady employment, even in positions that weren't good fits, inability to pursue additional education or training that could improve career prospects, and elimination of volunteer opportunities that could provide networking and skill development but didn't offer immediate income. At this point in Rachel's journey, 18 months after completing her master's degree with the expectation that advanced education would provide career stability and financial security, she found herself trapped in a cycle of part-time employment that provided insufficient income for loan repayment while requiring full-time commitment across multiple positions. The educational investment that was supposed to break her family's cycle of poverty had instead created debt obligations that made financial stability impossible while restricting her career options to survival-focused employment rather than the meaningful social work practice she had envisioned when she first applied to college 8 years earlier. But what Rachel couldn't have known, as she struggled through another day of juggling multiple jobs while managing overwhelming debt obligations, was that the worst aspects of her financial crisis were still ahead. And the true test of her resilience would come when personal circumstances beyond her control would transform her difficult but manageable situation into a desperate crisis that would force her to make decisions that everyone would advise against, ultimately leading her to the discovery that would vindicate her persistence and transform her financial nightmare into extraordinary opportunity. The student loan debt avalanche that buried Rachel Morrison began with what seemed like a routine notification in September 2023, when Great Lakes Educational Services informed her that her federal loan portfolio was being transferred to MOHELA, Missouri Higher Education Loan Authority, as part of a massive federal servicing contract reorganization that would affect millions of borrowers across the United States. The transfer notification that arrived via email and postal mail included warnings about potential payment processing delays, instructions for creating new online accounts, and assurances that borrower benefits and payment history would be preserved. During the transition, promises that would prove devastatingly false for Rachel and thousands of other borrowers caught in the administrative chaos that followed. The loan servicing transfer complications that began immediately after the MOHELA transition included login credentials that didn't work despite following all setup instructions, customer service phone lines that resulted in 2-hour hold times before disconnecting automatically, and payment processing systems that were offline for 3 weeks during the critical period when Rachel's monthly payments were due. The payment application errors that occurred during the transition included Rachel's September payment of $1,652 being applied to interest only instead of principal and interest as intended, October payment being posted to the wrong loan group and credited to someone else's account, and November payment being rejected despite sufficient funds in Rachel's checking account and proper electronic authorization. The customer service nightmare that Rachel experienced during the MOHELA transition included representatives who couldn't access her complete loan history, conflicting information about payment due dates and amounts, and transfers between different departments that required explaining her situation repeatedly to staff members who seemed unfamiliar with the loan servicing transfer process. The documentation requests that MOHELA made included requiring Rachel to provide employment verification, income documentation, and payment history that should have been available in their systems, while threatening default proceedings if documentation wasn't received within deadlines that were shorter than standard postal delivery times. The automated payment disruption that occurred during the servicing transfer eliminated Rachel's auto-pay discount of 0.25% on her federal loans, required re-enrollment in electronic payment systems that weren't functioning properly, and triggered late fees when the automated system failed to process payments that had been successfully debited from Rachel's bank account. The late fee accumulation that resulted from system failures included $50 penalties for each missed or misapplied payment, additional interest charges that accumulated daily on unpaid balances, and credit reporting that showed missed payments. Despite Rachel's attempts to maintain her payment schedule during the administrative transition, the income-driven repayment recertification crisis that coincided with the loan servicing transfer included Mohila's requirement that Rachel resubmit all income documentation despite having completed annual recertification with Great Lakes just 3 months earlier, new forms that weren't available online due to system problems and processing delays. That resulted in Rachel's payments reverting to standard 10-year repayment amounts of $2,340 monthly, while her recertification was pending review. The recertification processing delays that extended for 4 months included Rachel making payments she couldn't afford at the higher amount, accumulation of additional interest during the review period, and retroactive payment adjustments that created confusion about her account balance and payment history. The private loan complications that accelerated during the same period included Sallie Mae's notification that Rachel's variable interest rates were increasing from 9.25% to 11.8%. Due to Federal Reserve rate adjustments, payment amount increases from $440 to $530 monthly for her private loan obligations, and elimination of forbearance options that had previously provided temporary relief during periods of financial hardship. The private loan servicer communications that Rachel received included promotional materials for loan consolidation that required excellent credit scores she no longer possessed, offers for additional borrowing at even higher interest rates, and warnings about default consequences that included immediate acceleration of full loan balances and aggressive collection procedures. The credit score destruction that accelerated during the loan servicing chaos included late payment reporting that occurred despite Rachel's attempts to maintain payments during system failures, credit utilization increases when Rachel used credit cards to cover living expenses, while her increased loan payments consumed more of her income, and account closure notifications from credit card companies that were monitoring her debt-to-income ratio and decided she represented excessive risk. The credit monitoring alerts that Rachel received included notifications of score decreases from 412 to 298 within 3 months, new collection accounts that appeared due to medical bills she couldn't afford during the loan payment crisis, and identity monitoring warnings about potential fraud when multiple creditors attempted to verify her information simultaneously. And the employment impact that resulted from Rachel's escalating financial crisis included performance issues at Desert Hope Community Center, when stress and sleeplessness affected her clinical judgment during case management sessions with homeless clients, attendance problems when loan servicing phone calls required hours-long holds during business hours, and professional concerns when Rachel's personal financial crisis began affecting her ability to advocate effectively for clients facing similar economic hardships. The supervisor documentation that began accumulating in Rachel's employment file included written warnings about emotional boundaries with clients, concerns about her availability during required training sessions, and performance improvement. Plans that required demonstrating enhanced clinical skills while Rachel was struggling with personal trauma that mirrored her clients' experiences. The multiple employment coordination crisis that developed when Rachel's loan payments increased included scheduling conflicts between her three different positions, transportation costs that exceeded her vehicle's reliability, and time management failures when loan servicing problems required business hour phone calls that conflicted with her work obligations. The income volatility that resulted from these complications included reduced hours at the crisis hotline when Rachel couldn't guarantee availability during peak periods, elimination from overtime opportunities at the group home when her reliability was questioned, and loss of premium shift differentials at Desert Hope when Rachel had to decline weekend assignments due to exhaustion and transportation problems. The housing instability that accelerated during Rachel's loan payment crisis included eviction proceedings initiated by her landlord when rent payments became consistently late due to increased loan obligations, utility disconnection warnings when Rachel prioritized loan payments over electricity and water bills, and credit check failures that eliminated her from consideration for alternative housing options. The rental market discrimination that Rachel encountered included landlords who rejected applications based on her debt-to-income ratio, security deposit requirements that exceeded her available savings, and application fees that consumed money she needed for basic survival while providing no guarantee of housing approval. The transportation breakdown crisis that developed simultaneously included Rachel's 2015 Nissan Sentra, requiring $3,400 in transmission repairs that she couldn't afford, expired vehicle registration due to inability to pay renewal fees while managing increased loan payments, and auto insurance cancellation when automatic payments failed due to insufficient funds in her checking account after loan payment increases. The vehicle dependency that characterized Rachel's employment situation included 40-mile daily commutes between her three job locations, client home visits required for case management services, and emergency transportation needs when working. Crisis intervention shifts that could require immediate travel to hospital emergency departments or domestic violence shelters. The medical debt accumulation that began during Rachel's financial crisis included emergency room visits for stress-related symptoms when Rachel couldn't afford primary care appointments, prescription medications for anxiety and depression that weren't fully covered by her high-deductible health insurance, and dental problems that required immediate attention but generated bills exceeding $2,800 for procedures that couldn't be postponed. The healthcare rationing that Rachel implemented included skipping routine preventive care to reduce co-payment expenses, medication splitting to make prescriptions last longer, and avoidance of mental health treatment despite working in trauma-exposed positions that required emotional support and stress management. The insurance complications that multiplied during Rachel's crisis included health insurance premium increases when her employer changed carriers, elimination of mental health benefits that had provided some coverage for stress-related treatment, and disability insurance gaps that left Rachel vulnerable to income loss if health problems prevented her from maintaining her demanding work schedule. The insurance claim processing problems that Rachel encountered included prior authorization delays for medications that required immediate availability, coverage denials for treatments that her physicians considered medically necessary, and appeals processes that required extensive documentation and business hour phone calls that conflicted with her work obligations. The food insecurity that reached critical levels during this period included elimination of grocery shopping, except for basic necessities like bread and peanut butter, increased reliance on food pantries that served social service workers, but had limited hours and availability, and frequent meal skipping when transportation costs and loan payments consumed money needed for food purchases. The nutritional deficiency that resulted from inadequate food access included weight loss that affected Rachel's physical stamina during long work shifts, cognitive function impacts when irregular eating affected her blood sugar levels and concentration abilities, and immune system compromise that increased her susceptibility to illness during the high-stress period when she couldn't afford to miss work. The utility service disconnection cascade that began during Rachel's loan payment crisis included electricity, termination by PNM after $890 in unpaid bills accumulated, internet service cancellation that eliminated her ability to access online banking and loan servicer websites, and cell phone service suspension that interrupted communication with employers and clients who depended on her availability for crisis intervention services. The utility restoration complications that Rachel faced included security deposits of $400,600 per service when reconnecting after disconnection, late fees and reconnection charges that exceeded the original bill amounts, and same-day payment requirements that demanded cash or money orders when Rachel's banking relationships had been damaged by overdraft problems. The banking relationship deterioration that accelerated during the loan servicing crisis included overdraft fees that accumulated when automated loan payments were processed despite insufficient funds due to payment amount increases, account closure by Bank of America when negative balances persisted for more than 60 days, and elimination of direct deposit capabilities that forced Rachel to use expensive check cashing services for her employment payments. The financial isolation that resulted from banking problems included inability to establish new checking accounts due to check systems reporting, reliance on prepaid debit cards that charged fees for basic transactions, and cash-only financial management that made bill paying difficult and expensive. The loan default acceleration that began in January 2024 included missed payments when Rachel's income couldn't cover the increased payment amounts resulting from servicing transfer complications. Default notices that arrived via certified mail, requiring immediate payment of full loan balances, and collection agency assignments that began aggressive contact attempts, including daily phone calls and workplace communication threats. The default consequences that Mohila explained included immediate acceleration of full loan principal balances totaling $167,000 after interest accumulation, elimination of income-driven repayment options and deferment eligibility, and credit reporting that would further damage Rachel's ability to secure housing and employment. The collection agency harassment that intensified during Rachel's default period included representatives from Premier Credit who called Rachel's workplace requesting to speak with her about urgent financial matters, threats to garnish wages from her social work positions, and demands for immediate payment arrangements that required monthly amounts exceeding Rachel's total income from all three employment positions. The collection tactics that Rachel experienced included suggestions that she borrow money from family members to satisfy debt obligations, recommendations that she take additional jobs or work additional hours despite her current 60-hour work week, and implications that her professional licenses could be affected by unpaid student loan obligations. The legal proceeding threats that collection agencies made included garnishment warnings that would reduce Rachel's take-home pay by 25%, asset seizure possibilities that included her vehicle essential for maintaining employment, and court appearances that would require time off work and potential attorney representation she couldn't afford. The legal notice documentation that Rachel received included summons for debtor examinations that conflicted with her mandatory work schedules, judgment warnings that would create permanent records affecting future employment opportunities, and asset disclosure requirements that revealed her complete inability to satisfy debt obligations while maintaining basic survival needs. The professional license complications that emerged during Rachel's financial crisis included concerns from state licensing board representatives about social workers' financial stability, affecting their ability to manage client funds and make appropriate treatment decisions, continuing education requirements that Rachel couldn't afford during her debt crisis, and professional liability insurance increases that reflected higher risk assessments for practitioners experiencing financial stress. The ethics consultation that Rachel pursued through professional organizations included discussions about boundary issues when providing financial counseling to clients while experiencing similar problems, supervision requirements for managing personal stress that could affect clinical judgment, and documentation standards for maintaining professional competence during personal crisis periods. The peer relationship deterioration that occurred during Rachel's escalating crisis included isolation from social work colleagues who couldn't understand the severity of her financial situation, reduced participation in professional development activities due to registration costs and time constraints, and workplace tension when Rachel's personal problems began affecting team dynamics and client service quality. The professional network erosion that resulted from Rachel's crisis included eliminated opportunities for career advancement through professional relationships, reduced access to job referrals and recommendations that could improve her employment situation, and loss of mentorship relationships with experienced social workers who had previously provided career guidance and emotional support. The family relationship strain that intensified during Rachel's debt crisis included her mother Maria taking on additional cleaning jobs to help with Rachel's basic expenses while managing her own financial struggles, guilt about the educational investment that had created impossible debt obligations rather than financial security, and family conflicts, when relatives questioned Rachel's career choices and suggested abandoning social work for more lucrative employment. The intergenerational stress that characterized family discussions included Rachel's younger sister Carmen postponing her own college plans due to witnessing Rachel's financial crisis, extended family members who offered advice about just paying off the loans without understanding the mathematical impossibility of Rachel's situation, and isolation from family gatherings when Rachel couldn't afford transportation or contribute to shared expenses. The mental health deterioration that accelerated during the debt avalanche included panic attacks triggered by collection agency calls, severe depression that affected Rachel's ability to provide effective clinical services to clients, and trauma symptoms that resulted from constant financial threat and harassment. The therapeutic irony that Rachel experienced included providing mental health crisis intervention for clients while being unable to access mental health treatment for her own stress-related symptoms, understanding trauma-informed care principles while experiencing financial trauma that affected every aspect of her daily functioning, and maintaining professional competence standards while struggling with personal mental health challenges that required treatment she couldn't afford. The medication access crisis that developed during this period included inability to afford anxiety medications that had previously helped Rachel manage stress-related symptoms, rationing of antidepressants to make prescriptions last longer despite potentially dangerous dose reductions, and elimination of therapy appointments that had provided essential support during previous difficult periods. The self-medication risks that Rachel faced included increased caffeine consumption to manage fatigue from working multiple jobs, alcohol use as a sleep aid when stress prevented rest, and over-the-counter medication dependency for managing stress-related physical symptoms that required medical attention she couldn't afford. The sleep deprivation cycle that characterized Rachel's crisis included insomnia caused by anxiety about loan payments and collection calls, interrupted sleep when working overnight shifts at the group home, and nightmares about homelessness and professional failure that reflected her realistic fears about potential consequences of her financial situation. The fatigue impact that affected Rachel's work performance included concentration problems during client sessions, delayed response times when managing crisis situations, and emotional exhaustion that reduced her empathy and therapeutic effectiveness. During a period when clients needed consistent support, the social isolation that intensified during Rachel's debt crisis included elimination of social activities that required any financial expenditure, reduced communication with friends who couldn't understand the severity of her situation, and withdrawal from professional networking events that could provide career advancement opportunities but required registration fees and time away from income-generating employment. The relationship impact that Rachel's financial crisis created included dating impossibility when every conversation involved financial stress, family tension when Rachel couldn't contribute to household expenses or special occasions, and friendship strain when colleagues recognized Rachel's declining performance and emotional stability. The seasonal employment complications that affected Rachel's crisis included reduced hours at all 3 positions during summer months, when client needs decreased, elimination of overtime opportunities during holiday periods when crisis services operated with skeleton staffing, and increased competition for available shifts when other part-time employees needed additional income during slow periods. The income unpredictability that resulted from seasonal variations included monthly earnings that ranged from $1,800 to $3,200, depending on client census and available overtime, making budget planning impossible and preventing consistent loan payments that could prevent further default consequences. The tax complications that emerged during Rachel's financial crisis included inability to claim education credits due to her loan default status, loss of tax refunds to federal student loan collection that eliminated her primary source of emergency funds, and additional tax obligations when loan modification attempts created taxable forgiveness amounts despite providing no actual financial relief. The tax preparation costs that Rachel couldn't afford included professional assistance for navigating education credit complications, software fees for managing complex tax situations involving multiple employers and loan modification attempts, and documentation expenses for maintaining records required for potential loan forgiveness applications. The professional development elimination that Rachel implemented during her crisis included cancellation of conference registrations that could provide networking opportunities, postponement of specialty certification programs that could improve employment prospects, and reduced participation in continuing education beyond minimum licensing requirements. The career advancement barriers that resulted from Rachel's financial situation included inability to accept unpaid leadership opportunities that could lead to promotion, geographic limitations that prevented pursuing opportunities in higher-paying markets, and time constraints that eliminated evening classes or additional training that could qualify her for better positions. The loan rehabilitation attempts that Rachel pursued included applications for federal loan rehabilitation programs that required 9 consecutive on-time payments but didn't account for her variable income from multiple part-time positions, income verification requirements that were complicated by her multiple employers and irregular schedules, and rehabilitation payment calculations that exceeded her available income after basic survival expenses. The rehabilitation program limitations that Rachel discovered included requirements for payments that were higher than her previous income-driven amounts, processing delays that continued accumulating default consequences during application review, and program restrictions that eliminated benefits available under previous repayment plans. The debt consolidation impossibility that Rachel encountered included credit score requirements that she no longer met due to default and collection reporting, income verification standards that multiple part-time positions couldn't satisfy, and debt-to-income ratios that exceeded acceptable lending criteria for conventional consolidation loans. The alternative lending options that Rachel investigated included payday loans, with interest rates exceeding 400% annually, title loans that required vehicle equity she didn't possess, and personal loans from predatory lenders that would have created additional payment obligations without addressing her student loan crisis. The legal consultation costs that Rachel couldn't afford included attorney fees for bankruptcy consultation that revealed student loans weren't dischargeable, legal representation for collection defense that required retainers exceeding her available savings, and document preparation services for loan modification applications that charged fees she needed for basic survival expenses. The self-representation challenges that Rachel faced included court procedures that required knowledge she didn't possess, legal deadlines that conflicted with her work schedules, and documentation requirements that demanded time and resources she couldn't provide while maintaining employment necessary for basic survival. The emergency assistance application process that Rachel pursued included non-profit organizations that served social service workers facing financial crisis but had waiting lists exceeding 4 months and eligibility requirements that excluded people with full-time employment despite inadequate income levels. The assistance program limitations that Rachel discovered included maximum benefits that wouldn't significantly impact her debt obligations, one-time assistance that provided temporary relief without addressing underlying payment impossibility, and program restrictions that prevented repeated assistance for ongoing crisis situations. The credential maintenance crisis that developed during Rachel's financial emergency included social work licensing, renewal fees that she couldn't afford, while managing collection agency demands, continuing education requirements that required time and money unavailable during her survival-focused employment schedule, and professional liability insurance increases that reflected higher risk assessments. For practitioners experiencing financial instability, the license suspension threats that Rachel faced included potential loss of professional credentials that provided her only source of income, regulatory investigations of practitioners whose financial problems might affect client service quality, and ethics board concerns about social workers' ability to maintain professional boundaries while experiencing personal financial trauma. At this point in Rachel's crisis, 27 months after completing graduate school with expectations of career stability and meaningful work, she found herself trapped in an accelerating debt spiral that made survival increasingly impossible despite working more hours and maintaining employment in her chosen profession. The student loan servicing failures that had triggered her crisis had created default consequences that eliminated most options for debt resolution, while collection agencies pursued remedies that would make continued employment and basic survival mathematically impossible. The mathematical reality that Rachel faced showed monthly obligations exceeding $3,800 when including student loan default payments, collection agency demands, and basic survival expenses. While her variable income from 3 part-time social work positions averaged $2,190 monthly and was declining due to performance issues related to stress and financial trauma. The conventional wisdom that everyone offered, bankruptcy, career change, family assistance, failed to address the core problem that student loan debt couldn't be discharged, while social work employment couldn't generate sufficient income for debt, service, and basic survival. But what Rachel couldn't have known, as she struggled through another 18-hour day of managing crisis calls while facing her own financial crisis, was that the worst acceleration of her debt avalanche was still approaching, and the final cascade of system failures would soon force her into circumstances so desperate that the seemingly impossible decision about a fire-damaged church in rural New Mexico would become the only choice that offered any hope of survival. Despite universal opposition from everyone she trusted and conventional wisdom that suggested the decision would guarantee her complete financial destruction, the employment catastrophe that would push Rachel Morrison from merely impossible circumstances into complete desperation began on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning in July 2024, when Desert Hope Community Center's Executive Director Margaret Santos called an emergency staff meeting to announce that their primary federal funding source, a $2.8 million CHUD grant that supported 70% of the center's operations, had been eliminated in the latest congressional budget reconciliation, effective immediately with no transition period or alternative funding identified. The funding elimination that would destroy Rachel's most stable employment included termination of her case management position that provided $18 per hour for 32 hours weekly, elimination of health insurance benefits that had covered her stress-related medical needs, and loss of the professional development opportunities that had been essential for maintaining her social work licensing requirements. The non-profit sector collapse that accelerated throughout the summer of 2024 included simultaneous funding cuts to social service organizations across New Mexico, competition among unemployed social workers for the few remaining positions that survived budget eliminations, and salary reductions at organizations that managed to continue operations with reduced staffing and eliminated benefits. The employment market saturation that Rachel encountered during her job search included applications for positions that received over 200 qualified candidates, interviews where employers acknowledged they couldn't offer competitive salaries due to funding constraints, and temporary contract opportunities that provided no job security or benefits, while requiring the same professional qualifications and responsibilities as permanent positions. The unemployment benefit complications that Rachel discovered after losing her primary employment included disqualification due to her continued part-time work at the crisis hotline and group home, weekly benefit amounts that were calculated based on her highest earning quarter but didn't account for variable hours and multiple employers, and job search requirements that demanded full-time availability while she maintained her remaining part-time positions to prevent complete income loss. The unemployment office bureaucracy that Rachel navigated included weekly reporting requirements that conflicted with her work schedules, in-person appointments at offices that required transportation costs she couldn't afford, and documentation demands that required employer verification from organizations that had eliminated HR departments due to budget cuts. The crisis hotline position elimination that followed Desert Hope's closure included New Mexico crisis lines, announcement that state funding reductions would force consolidation of crisis services, elimination of evening shift positions that had provided Rachel's most reliable income source, and transition to volunteer-only staffing that eliminated paid crisis intervention positions throughout the state. The specialized training that Rachel had completed for crisis intervention work became worthless overnight when paid positions were eliminated, while volunteer opportunities required time commitments she couldn't afford when every available hour needed to generate income for basic survival and debt service obligations. The group home employment instability that intensified during the social services funding crisis included Horizons Group Home's reduction of overnight shift positions due to state Medicaid reimbursement cuts, increased competition for remaining shifts among staff members who had lost other employment, and elimination of premium pay rates for weekend and holiday coverage that had previously provided essential income during Rachel's financial crisis. The residential care industry consolidation that occurred throughout New Mexico included closure of smaller facilities that couldn't survive reduced state funding, corporate acquisition of surviving operations that prioritized profit margins over staff compensation, and conversion to part-time positions that eliminated benefits while maintaining the same care responsibilities. The healthcare employment barrier that Rachel encountered during her desperate job search included medical social work positions that required specialized certification she couldn't afford to obtain, hospital systems that had hiring freezes due to post-pandemic financial recovery, and healthcare organizations that required credit checks, eliminating Rachel from consideration. Due to her student loan default status, the healthcare sector preference for candidates without financial stress reflected concerns about social workers' ability to make appropriate discharge planning decisions when experiencing personal financial crisis, insurance liability issues. When practitioners faced potential conflicts of interest and patient safety considerations, when stressed employees might make judgment errors affecting patient care. The private practice impossibility that Rachel explored included licensing requirements for independent clinical practice that demanded 2 years of supervised experience she hadn't completed, liability insurance costs exceeding $2,400 annually for solo practitioners, and startup expenses for office space and professional development that required capital investment she couldn't make while managing survival expenses and debt obligations. The private practice income reality that licensed practitioners explained included months of client development before generating sustainable income, insurance reimbursement delays that required cash flow management during payment processing periods, and business management responsibilities that required time and expertise beyond clinical training. The retail employment desperation that Rachel pursued included applications for Target, Walmart, and grocery store positions that offered immediate employment but paid wages insufficient for her debt obligations and basic survival needs, interviews, where managers questioned her commitment due to her advanced education, and scheduling conflicts when retail availability requirements conflicted with her remaining social work commitments. The employment discrimination that Rachel faced included assumptions that she would leave retail positions as soon as better opportunities became available, concerns about overqualification creating employee retention problems, and wage offers that reflected entry-level status despite her master's degree and professional experience. The gig economy attempts that Rachel tried included DoorDash and Uber driving that required vehicle reliability her 2015 Nissan Sentra couldn't provide, freelance writing opportunities that paid per-piece rates averaging $15 hourly without benefits or consistency, and online tutoring positions that required technology and internet access she couldn't maintain due to utility disconnections. The gig work income unpredictability that Rachel experienced included weekly earnings that ranged from $89 to $340, depending on demand and vehicle availability, payment processing delays that occurred when she most needed immediate income, and tax complications that required quarterly estimated payments she couldn't afford while managing immediate survival needs. The eviction acceleration that coincided with Rachel's employment crisis included her landlord Roberto Martinez's patience, exhausting after 4 months of partial rent payments, legal proceedings that required court appearances during business hours when Rachel needed to be working or job searching, and 30-day notice requirements that provided insufficient time to secure alternative housing with her damaged credit and employment instability. The eviction court proceedings that Rachel attended without legal representation included housing court judges who were sympathetic but legally required to enforce lease agreements, mediation attempts that required payment arrangements. Rachel, couldn't meet, and final judgments that created permanent eviction records affecting her future housing applications. The alternative housing impossibility that Rachel discovered during her eviction period included rental applications that required income verification, showing gross monthly earnings 3 times the rent amount, security deposits ranging from $1,800 to $3,200 for apartments that would consider applicants with poor credit, and application fees of $150 to $300 per property that consumed money she needed for basic survival while providing no guarantee of housing approval. The housing discrimination that Rachel encountered included landlords who explicitly stated they wouldn't rent to people with student loan defaults, property managers who required employment verification from full-time positions she no longer possessed, and credit score requirements that eliminated her from consideration for safe, affordable housing options. The utility service termination cascade that accelerated during Rachel's employment crisis included electricity disconnection by P&M when unpaid bills reached $1,240 during New Mexico's brutal summer heat, internet cancellation that eliminated her ability to apply for jobs online or maintain communication with potential employers, and cell phone service suspension that interrupted her availability for interview scheduling and employment coordination. The utility restoration impossibility that Rachel faced included security deposits exceeding $800 per service for customers with poor payment history, reconnection fees that doubled the original bill amounts, and same-day payment requirements that demanded cash when Rachel's banking relationships had been destroyed by overdraft accumulation. The transportation breakdown crisis that reached critical levels during Rachel's job search included her vehicle. Failing emissions testing due to engine problems requiring $3,800 in repairs, expired registration that made driving illegal but was necessary for reaching job interviews, and auto insurance cancellation that created liability risks when driving, was essential for employment seeking. The public transportation limitations in Albuquerque included bus routes that didn't serve major employment centers, scheduling that required 2-hour commutes for trips that took 30 minutes by car, and costs that exceeded $200 monthly, while providing inadequate access to job opportunities throughout the metropolitan area. The medical crisis that compounded Rachel's employment emergency included stress-related symptoms that required emergency room treatment she couldn't afford, prescription medications for anxiety and blood pressure that she couldn't purchase due to pharmacy costs, and dental problems that created pain affecting her ability to interview effectively while generating bills exceeding $4,200 for procedures that couldn't be postponed. The health insurance loss that accompanied her unemployment included COBRA premiums of $580 monthly that exceeded her available income, marketplace insurance with deductibles that made coverage essentially useless for her medical needs, and elimination of prescription coverage that had previously helped manage stress-related health problems. The food insecurity that reached starvation levels during Rachel's crisis included complete elimination of grocery shopping except for bread and peanut butter purchased with remaining cash, increased reliance on food pantries that required transportation she couldn't afford and had limited operating hours, and frequent meal skipping that caused weight loss and fatigue affecting her job search performance. The nutritional deficiency symptoms that Rachel experienced included concentration problems during interviews, physical weakness that affected her appearance and energy levels, and digestive issues that required medical attention she couldn't afford, while creating additional stress about health complications. The family relationship breakdown that intensified during Rachel's complete crisis included her mother, Maria's inability to provide additional financial assistance while working, extra cleaning jobs to help with previous emergencies, conflict with her brother Miguel, who suggested Rachel should have chosen a real career that pays actual money, and isolation from extended family members who became exhausted by ongoing crisis and requests for assistance. The generational trauma that Rachel's crisis created included her younger sister Carmen deciding against college attendance after witnessing Rachel's educational debt destruction, family conflict about whether higher education was worth the financial risk, and guilt about the family resources that had been invested in Rachel's education without producing the promised financial security. The mental health emergency that developed during Rachel's employment crisis included suicidal ideation triggered by hopelessness about her impossible situation, panic attacks that occurred during job interviews and affected her professional presentation, and severe depression that made basic daily functioning difficult while she needed maximum energy and optimism for employment seeking. The mental health treatment impossibility that Rachel faced included elimination of therapy appointments due to cost and lack of insurance coverage, medication rationing that created dangerous dose reductions for antidepressants and anxiety medications, and crisis intervention needs that she couldn't access despite being trained to provide similar services for others. The legal complication acceleration that occurred during Rachel's employment crisis included collection agency lawsuits that required court appearances during job interview times, garnishment orders that would affect any future employment income, and judgment liens that prevented her from accessing any conventional borrowing options that might provide temporary relief. The legal representation impossibility that Rachel faced included attorney consultation fees exceeding $300 per hour for bankruptcy or collection defense, legal aid waiting lists that extended for months while her crisis demanded immediate attention, and self-representation challenges in legal proceedings that required knowledge and time she didn't possess. The professional license jeopardy that emerged during Rachel's crisis included state licensing board concerns about social workers whose financial instability might affect their clinical judgment, continuing education requirements that she couldn't afford during her survival-focused period, and ethics investigations that could result from complaints about practitioners who appeared unable to manage their own affairs while counseling others about life management. The professional reputation destruction that Rachel feared included documentation of her employment terminations and eviction in background checks for future social work positions, references from supervisors who had documented performance problems during her financial crisis, and networking relationship damage when colleagues learned about her desperate circumstances. The seasonal employment elimination that occurred during summer 2024 included reduced demand for social services when schools were closed and many programs operated with minimal staffing, competition for temporary positions among hundreds of unemployed social workers throughout New Mexico, and elimination of overtime opportunities that had previously provided essential income during previous financial difficulties. The employment market timing that worked against Rachel included budget year cycles that meant most hiring would be delayed until fall semester, interview scheduling that occurred during summer vacation periods when decision-makers were unavailable, and funding announcements that wouldn't occur until September when Rachel's crisis demanded immediate income generation. The debt collection intensification that escalated during Rachel's unemployment included daily harassment calls from multiple collection agencies representing different loan services, workplace contact threats that could affect any future employment opportunities, and asset seizure warnings that included her vehicle essential for job searching and any future employment. The collection agency coordination that Rachel discovered included information sharing between agencies that resulted in simultaneous contact from multiple companies, legal threats that were being pursued simultaneously by different representatives, and payment demands, the total amounts exceeding Rachel's annual earning potential in social work, even if she could secure full-time employment. The bankruptcy consultation reality that Rachel finally pursued included attorney explanations that student loan debt couldn't be discharged, while bankruptcy would eliminate what little credit access she retained, filing fees exceeding $2,500 that she couldn't afford while facing homelessness, and asset liquidation requirements that would eliminate her vehicle and any remaining possessions that provided basic survival capabilities. The bankruptcy inadequacy for Rachel's situation included explanations that her primary debt obligations would survive discharge, employment impacts when employers conducted credit checks, and elimination of any potential future borrowing capabilities that might provide emergency relief during continued financial instability. The religious community assistance that Rachel sought included churches that offered emergency assistance but had waiting lists and assistance caps that wouldn't significantly impact her debt obligations, faith-based organizations that provided food and temporary shelter but couldn't address systematic debt problems, and spiritual counseling that offered emotional support but no practical solutions for mathematical impossibility of her financial situation. The charity assistance limitations that Rachel discovered included maximum benefits of $500 to $800 that provided temporary relief without addressing underlying payment impossibility, eligibility requirements that excluded people with any employment despite inadequate income levels, and one-time assistance policies that prevented repeated help for ongoing crisis situations. The geographic mobility elimination that resulted from Rachel's crisis included inability to relocate for better employment opportunities due to moving costs and security deposit requirements, social work licensing transfer complications that required fees and processing time she couldn't afford, and vehicle unreliability that prevented travel to job opportunities in other metropolitan areas. The location trap that Rachel faced included limitation to Albuquerque's saturated social work market, elimination of opportunities in higher-cost areas where salaries might be better but wouldn't offset increased living expenses, and isolation from family support networks if she could somehow manage relocation despite financial impossibility. The certified mail discovery that would change everything occurred on October 15, 2024, when Rachel retrieved a legal notice from Montoya and Associates attorneys representing the estate of one Esperanza Herrera, informing Rachel that she had been named as the sole beneficiary of a fire-damaged Methodist church property in Tierra Amarilla, New Mexico, despite Rachel having no memory of anyone by that name or any connection to the remote northern New Mexico community. The inheritance notification that seemed like cruel irony included property descriptions of a 3,200-square-foot church building that had been severely damaged in an electrical fire in 2019, located on 2.1 acres 40 miles from the nearest grocery store, with accumulated property taxes totaling $67,000 and immediate repair estimates ranging from $89,000 to $127,000 just to make the structure weathertight and safe for occupancy. The estate attorney consultation that Rachel arranged using her last $200 revealed that Esperanza Herrera had been an elderly woman who had attended graduate school at the University of New Mexico during the 1960s, had worked as a social worker for New Mexico state government for 38 years, and had apparently followed Rachel's academic and professional progress through alumni networks before her death in September 2024. The inheritance conditions that the estate attorney explained included immediate responsibility for property taxes that had accumulated during the 5 years since the fire, liability for ongoing property maintenance and security, and ownership of a building that local contractors estimated would require complete reconstruction to be habitable. The family intervention that Rachel endured when she mentioned the inheritance included emotional appeals from her mother about abandoning her social work career for another hopeless real estate venture, practical concerns from her brother Miguel about the financial impossibility of renovating a fire-damaged building, with negative net worth, and unanimous agreement from relatives that accepting the inheritance would accelerate rather than prevent Rachel's financial collapse, while stranding her in geographic isolation 40 miles from employment opportunities. The expert consultation that Rachel pursued using borrowed money included a building inspector who estimated repair costs of $127,000 to $189,000 for basic habitability, a contractor who warned about structural damage that might make renovation economically impossible, and a real estate agent who described the property as unsuitable for anyone seeking reasonable access to employment or modern conveniences. The financial analysis that Rachel completed regarding the church inheritance revealed that property acquisition would require immediate payment of $67,000 in back taxes, while creating additional obligations for insurance, utilities installation, and basic repairs that she couldn't afford with her non-existent income and destroyed credit. The expert advice consensus that Rachel received from attorneys, contractors, and family members uniformly recommended declining the inheritance to avoid additional debt obligations, accepting homelessness as preferable to rural isolation without employment opportunities, and focusing on conventional debt resolution that might eventually provide manageable payment arrangements for her student loan obligations. The decision timeline that property tax authorities imposed included 30-day requirements for inheritance acceptance and tax payment, foreclosure proceedings that would eliminate the inheritance opportunity if taxes weren't paid immediately, and immediate liability for property maintenance and insurance that would begin upon inheritance acceptance regardless of her ability to pay ongoing obligations. The mathematical impossibility that Rachel faced included property obligations that would exceed $4,200 monthly, including taxes, insurance, and basic utilities, while her potential income in Tierra Amarilla was essentially zero with no social work positions available within commuting distance. The desperate decision that Rachel made, despite universal opposition, included liquidating her final possessions, including laptop computer, remaining jewelry, and household goods through emergency pawnshop sales that provided $3,400 in cash, borrowing $2,800 from predatory lenders at interest rates exceeding 200% annually, and accepting that inheritance acceptance would consume her final resources while potentially providing shelter during her recovery period. The point of no return that Rachel reached included recognition that conventional approaches guaranteed immediate homelessness, while church ownership provided theoretical shelter, even if employment remained impossible and debt obligations continued accumulating. The inheritance acceptance process that Rachel completed on November 2, 2024, included signing legal documents that made her responsible for all property obligations, arranging emergency payment of back taxes through money orders and cash advances, and acknowledging that successful property ownership would leave her with approximately $340 for all other expenses, while facing immediate obligations for basic utilities, insurance, and transportation to reach the remote property. The family relationship damage that resulted from Rachel's decision included her mother's tearful disappointment about throwing away everything we've worked for, her brother's anger about stupid decisions that will make everything worse, and extended family consensus that Rachel had lost perspective and judgment due to stress and desperation. The church arrival that occurred on November 5, 2024, revealed a property that was worse than all expert warnings had suggested, with fire damage that had created partial roof collapse, water damage from years of exposure that had rotted floor, joists, and created mold problems and structural issues that made large portions of the building unsafe for occupancy. The initial shelter arrangements that Rachel managed included sleeping in her car in the church parking area, using camping equipment purchased with her remaining cash for basic survival needs, and attempting to secure one room that appeared structurally sound enough for temporary habitation. The isolation reality that Rachel faced included cell phone service that was intermittent and required driving 15 miles to reach reliable coverage, internet access that was non-existent, without expensive satellite installation, and grocery shopping that required 80-mile round trips to reach basic supplies. The winter preparation emergency that Rachel confronted included New Mexico mountain weather that would soon make unheated shelter dangerous, heating system installation requirements that exceeded her resources, and insulation needs that were essential for survival during approaching freezing temperatures. The church exploration that Rachel undertook during her first week of ownership included systematic examination of fire damage, water intrusion assessment, and structural evaluation, using basic tools found in abandoned maintenance areas. The building investigation that Rachel pursued revealed that the fire had started in the electrical system but hadn't reached the main sanctuary area, where original 1960s construction remained largely intact despite water damage from roof problems that had developed after the fire eliminated proper drainage systems. The altar area inspection that Rachel conducted while cleaning debris from the sanctuary revealed unusual acoustic properties when her footsteps created hollow, echoing sounds that seemed inconsistent with the concrete slab foundation that supported the rest of the building. The floor examination that Rachel pursued using a pry bar, found among abandoned tools, revealed that several floorboards near the altar appeared to be newer replacements that didn't match the original oak flooring throughout the sanctuary. The hidden access discovery that Rachel made while investigating the mismatched flooring included a concealed panel beneath the altar area that opened to reveal a carefully constructed underground chamber approximately 15 feet by 20 feet, accessed by sturdy wooden steps and containing climate-controlled storage systems that had remained operational despite the building's abandonment. The chamber investigation that Rachel conducted using her cell phone flashlight revealed professional-grade filing systems, humidity control equipment that appeared to have been professionally installed, and electrical systems that were separate from the church's main power infrastructure. The document discovery that occurred when Rachel opened the filing cabinets revealed hundreds of manila folders containing FBI letterhead documents, surveillance reports with classification markings, and correspondence between federal agents that appeared to span from the 1960s through the 1990s. The file examination that Rachel conducted revealed detailed surveillance records of civil rights, activists, anti-war protesters, and political dissidents, including photographs, wiretap transcripts, and operational reports that documented domestic surveillance programs that had been conducted without public knowledge or legal authorization. The document authentication research that Rachel conducted using her intermittent internet connection revealed that many of the files contained information about surveillance programs that had been the subject of congressional investigations, court cases that had demanded disclosure of FBI domestic surveillance activities, and historical research that had been unable to locate primary source documentation that appeared to be preserved in the church's hidden chamber. The historical significance assessment that Rachel pursued through online research suggested that her discovery represented evidence of domestic surveillance programs that had been concealed from congressional oversight and public scrutiny for Over 30 years, the legal consultation that Rachel arranged through secure communication methods led her to attorney David Chen from the Government Accountability Project, who confirmed that Rachel's discovery potentially qualified for federal whistleblower protection under laws designed to encourage disclosure of government misconduct. Chen's initial assessment of photographed documents revealed evidence of domestic surveillance programs that had operated without congressional authorization, civil rights violations that had been denied by federal officials, and intelligence activities that had been concealed from legislative oversight committees responsible for ensuring constitutional compliance. The document organization project that Rachel undertook during her first month in the church revealed the systematic nature of the hidden archive, with files organized by operation names, target categories, and chronological periods that suggested decades of coordinated surveillance activities. The file categorization that Rachel completed using her systematic approach revealed over 1,247 individual documents spanning domestic surveillance operations from 1963 to 1995, including memoranda between FBI directors and field agents, operational budgets for activities that had been funded without congressional knowledge, and correspondence that revealed coordination between federal agencies and local law enforcement for surveillance activities. The government contact that Rachel initiated through congressional intelligence oversight committees resulted in immediate federal investigation of the documents, FBI verification of authenticity through classified databases, and recognition that Rachel's discovery represented the most significant domestic surveillance document recovery in decades. The whistleblower protection that federal investigators provided included personal security measures due to the sensitive nature of the materials, legal representation for navigating federal disclosure procedures, and preliminary assessment that Rachel's discovery qualified for substantial compensation under federal whistleblower protection statutes. The authentication process that federal investigators conducted included forensic analysis of paper composition and printing methods that confirmed the document's authenticity, cross-reference verification with existing declassified materials that corroborated operational details and personnel names, and historical analysis that placed the documents within known FBI surveillance programs that had previously lacked primary source documentation. The investigation coordination that developed around Rachel's disclosure included involvement of the FBI's Inspection Division, Congressional Intelligence Committees, and Department of Justice officials responsible for reviewing historical intelligence community violations. The compensation determination that federal officials announced included preliminary whistleblower reward assessment of $12.8 million under federal protection statutes, representing maximum compensation for disclosures that provide substantial assistance to congressional oversight and historical understanding of government activities. The payment structure that officials established included immediate award of $3.2 million for Rachel's initial disclosure and cooperation with authentication, quarterly payments totaling $6.4 million over 2 years for ongoing assistance with congressional hearings and legal proceedings, and final payment of $3.2 million upon completion of investigation and implementation of reforms based on disclosed evidence. The debt elimination process that Rachel's compensation enabled included immediate payment of all student loan obligations, totaling $189,000 plus accumulated penalties and collection costs, resolution of legal proceedings that had threatened garnishment and asset seizure, and establishment of legal representation for addressing collection agency harassment and credit repair. The financial restoration that Rachel achieved through her whistleblower compensation included elimination of all debt obligations within 60 days of initial payment, establishment of emergency savings that would prevent future financial vulnerability, and investment of remaining compensation to provide permanent financial security. The consulting opportunities that emerged from Rachel's disclosure included contracts with congressional oversight committees who valued her analytical skills and attention to detail for ongoing investigation of intelligence community activities. Academic institutions seeking assistance with historical research about domestic surveillance programs, and government reform organizations wanting her insights about improving whistleblower protection and encouraging disclosure of government misconduct. The career transformation that Rachel experienced included transition from survival-focused employment to meaningful work that utilized her social work training in government accountability and historical preservation. The church renovation project that Rachel's financial security enabled included complete restoration of the fire-damaged structure into a comfortable residence and research facility, installation of modern utilities and internet infrastructure that allowed remote consulting work, and preservation of the hidden chamber as a historical archive that honored the significance of her discovery. The property transformation that Rachel achieved included conversion of the church sanctuary into a library and research space, residential renovation of auxiliary buildings for comfortable living, and security improvements that protected both her privacy and the historical significance of the property. The life transformation that Rachel accomplished through her desperate church purchase included vindication of the decision that everyone had opposed, demonstration that maintaining personal integrity during impossible circumstances could create extraordinary outcomes, and proof that conventional wisdom often failed to account for possibilities that couldn't be predicted or planned. The historical significance that Rachel's discovery achieved included contributing to public understanding of domestic surveillance programs, supporting congressional reforms of intelligence community oversight, and preserving documentation that had been missing from historical records for decades. Rachel Morrison's extraordinary journey from a desperate social worker facing homelessness to a nationally significant whistleblower and government accountability consultant proved that sometimes the most seemingly impossible choices, which appear guaranteed to accelerate failure according to all expert analysis, can lead to outcomes that vindicate faith in principles over pragmatism and demonstrate that individual courage can create historical change, extending far beyond personal circumstances to serve constitutional democracy and public welfare. Charred, fire-damaged church that had seemed like Rachel's final desperate mistake had become the foundation for a new life of financial security, meaningful work, and historical significance that honored both her social work values and her commitment to truth and justice. Rachel's story proved that maintaining ethical principles during systematic oppression could create opportunities for extraordinary service, and that individual persistence in the face of impossible circumstances could reveal hidden resources that transformed personal survival into public benefit and historical contribution. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.